Thank you very much indeed, David, and thank you very much to the Anscombe Centre for the kind invitation to talk today. It's a real honour and a privilege to be with you. Before starting the talk, just a couple of introductory slides. One, I think, as it's good practice, I always put up details of organisations who are willing to hear people who are having sad or suicidal thoughts. Perhaps less relevant for this audience, but I think it's always good practice to do so. Also, as David mentioned, this talk is based on my book, which came out very recently, and I can give you a flavour of some of the arguments in that book. So this is basically the structure. I'll talk a little bit about the sort of background of the debate and what inspired me to write the book. Then I'm going to look at the basis of the legal claim that there should be a right to be protected from committing suicide. I'll try not to get too technical because I know there are quite a few non-lawyers here. And then we'll be looking at some of the ethical arguments as well. One of the big things that inspired me to write the book was a seminar I had with some students who had set the normal readings on the ethical and legal issues around end of life. And I started the seminar with a very general question. I said, imagine someone goes to their doctor and says, I'm feeling absolutely dreadful, I want to die, can you help me? I asked them what the law would say the doctor could do and what they thought the law ought to say the doctor should do. And the majority of those speaking, not surprisingly, perhaps set up the law correctly, saying that no, the doctor would not be able to help them commit suicide or indeed do euthanasia. But most of them thought that the doctor should be allowed at that point to assist them to commit suicide if they said they wanted to die. But when I then said to them, so is that the advice I should pass on to the college nurse that if a student comes to see them being suicidal, that the right thing to do is to offer suicide? Of course, they immediately said, oh no, we didn't think you were talking about that kind of case. We assumed you were talking about someone who was seriously ill. They were immediately, their thoughts on suicide were dominated by their kind of legal cases of people with terminal illnesses, serious disabilities who've been seeking suicide. And secondly, it was inspired by this provocative book by Kevin Ewell, Assisted Suicide, the Liberal Humanist Case Against Liberalisation. And in that rather remarkable book, he argues that against legalising assisted suicide because it reduces suicide to a medical choice. What should be profound and meaningful loses its meaning. And he goes through three examples of suicide which dominate his book. And they include, for example, a Tibetan monk who has an act of rebellion and outrage at how Buddhists were being treated, set himself alight as a powerful statement. And with these and a couple of other examples, Professor Ewell argues that actually suicide can be a powerful, profound, deep statement. And if it was somehow legalized and permitted through medical channels, this would deprive suicide of its powerful statement. And indeed, to me shockingly, he concludes the book with the proposal that we should make deadly drugs available to the public so that they can make their own profound suicidal statement, rather than having to go through courts and through medical professionals, which would rob people of the chance of making the profound statement the suicide can make. What I think both my students and I think Professor Ewell were mistaken about is actually the nature of the suicide, the typical case of someone who is wanting to die. And the cases that have dominated the newspapers of people with terminal illnesses, profound disabilities, are not your typical suicide or typical attempted suicide. The kind of cases that are far more typical are the ones I've put up on the slide here. Someone unable to cope with being domestically abused by their partner. a student distressed by acne in exam results, the tragic case of a student being wrongly told they'd failed their exams. These are not cases of people making some profound statement, as Professor Yule talked about it. These are tragic mistakes. These are utterly sad cases. These are not people driven to make some important political. And yet these are the kind of suicides that actually make up the bulk of suicides. And when we look at the statistics, the highest rate of suicide is for men aged 45 to 49. That's the largest demographic group, not those who are elderly at the end of their life. It's men typically following a divorce or unemployment. The next largest group is among students. 200 children a year commit suicide. And if we look at those kind of figures compared with the roughly 35 people a year who travel to Dignitas, those are very much the minority of suicide cases. So I think much of our thinking about how should we respond to people who want to commit suicide is dominated by the exceptional cases of people with terminal illnesses and so forth, rather than actually the most common kind of case, the man whose wife has just left. And that, I think, has skewed the debate and skewed the kind of response and the arguments that are commonly used. So we've seen, I think, a change gradually over time in our debates and discussions around suicide. At one time, it was very much dominated as a moral issue. Is it a sin to commit suicide? There was extensive discussions about that. The literature then seemed to move to a debate about the links between suicide and mental illness. Whereas now, it's seen very much as an expression of autonomy, that suicide is an exercise of people's choice. And that's something I will challenge later on in this talk. So moving now on to the legal case for saying someone has a right to be protected from committing suicide. Now, the most common reaction I get when I say to other lawyers, that I explain to other lawyers the title of my book, is say it again, because it sounds strange. Interestingly, they often assume I'm saying I mean a right to suicide or a right to assisted suicide. And it seems a strange idea. When and some lawyers just find it difficult to comprehend how such a right could exist. Or those lawyers who are a bit aware of the literature will say, oh yes, those cases where someone in a mental hospital, for example, has been negligently allowed to die, there you might have a right to commit suicide. But I'm going to argue that in fact that right is a far more extensive right that every one of us holds. So to introduce the legal concept, the leading case in the UK is the case involving Melanie Rabone, an utterly tragic case. Melanie Rabone was normally a very happy young woman, but she was prone to moments of intense depression, which would lead her feeling suicidal. Fortunately, she had previously received help whenever she had those moments of intense depression. And was always extremely grateful when she recovered and was back to her normal life. But on the tragic time in question, she was taken to hospital with, again, a severe bout of depression. The hospital failed to adequately care for her. She was released or allowed to leave, and she committed suicide. The Supreme Court held that that was a breach of her human rights, that the state, through the National Health Trust Hospital, had a duty to protect her right to life. And by failing to adequately protect it, putting in reasonable steps to protect her, that was a breach of her right to life. So that's the kind of right we're talking about. And it comes from Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights. That's what I'll use. Of course, nearly all, human rights conventions have the right to life, but I'll use the European Convention because it's the one I'm listed with. Now, when the European Convention was first enacted, it was seen primarily as a negative right, a right that stopped the state doing things to you. In other words, Article 2, the state mustn't kill you. Your right to life meant the state mustn't kill you. But gradually, the thinking of the European Court has developed to say, well, look, if you've got a right to life, not only can that be attacked by the state, it can be attacked by other citizens. And so if you've got a right to life, that means you have a right to be protected by the state, not only by the state killing you, but also by the state not stopping other citizens killing you. And it's particularly, the court has done a lot of work in the context of domestic abuse, using the right to protection from torture and inhuman degrading treatment, where they've said not only must the state not torture you or subject you to inhuman or degrading treatment, but the state would also protect you from your partner if they're abusing you. And so it's this kind of thinking that has led to this idea of a positive right under Article 2, that the state not only must not kill you, but it must protect your a challenge to your life from others, or indeed from yourself. And so there's your right to life leads to positive obligations on the state to protect you from being killed. So these have been set out in more detail in the Rabone case and the Fernandez de Oliveira case against Portugal. And it's broken down for our particular context, these positive obligations on the state. So first of all, we've got the general duty to every citizen to have a legal and administrative system that protects people's lives, and that includes from committing suicide. So that's the general duty that's owed to everybody to have in place suicide prevention strategies. Secondly, there is a duty to groups. So there's a particular group who are liable to commit suicide. Again, you have strategies to protect that particular group of people. Thirdly, and this is the most controversial one, is the operational duty to protect the life of a particular individual that the state knows about. So this was the one that was relevant in the Rabone case. Why the third one is probably the most controversial one is that the first two are very hard to bring legal proceedings in, because you're going to have to show that if only the state has got an effective suicide prevention strategy, my relative wouldn't have committed suicide, for example. And that's going to be difficult to establish. So it's that third one that the courts have done most work on. But when does this operational duty arise? When does the state have an obligation to protect an individual from committing suicide? Now, as Lord Dyson said, and this is the traditional view, there's a duty to protect persons from a real and immediate risk of suicide, at least where they are under the control of the state. And so this is where most of the cases have arisen: someone who's in prison, someone who is in hospital, someone who is in the military, where they're under the control of the state, and therefore there's an obligation that arises to them. But if we look at the wording Lord Dyson uses, he does use the word that at least where they're under the control of the state. And so we begin to see there an acceptance that actually it might be that this kind of right is broader than that. And indeed, he goes on to accept that the European Court has been willing to accept cases where the person is not under the duty of the state. So the Azerbaijan case, at the end there, the police went to evict someone who was illegally squatting in a building. and they became extremely distressed and then indicated they were going to commit suicide. The police did nothing, they just stood by. Sadly, the person did then kill themselves. And now they weren't in any way under the control of the state, but the European Court was willing to extend the duty. And indeed, in the Sunderland case, they made the point that Lord Dyson had a series of indicator when the duty might arise. So we're beginning to see here the courts being willing to accept that it's not just people like prisoners and people in hospitals, it might be a broader duty to protect people from suicide. In GS4 Care and Boland, it was suggested that the crucial thing is whether the person is a particularly vulnerable person. So the state might have a duty to protect people from committing suicide if they are particularly vulnerable. But that might lead you to the question to ask on many people, perhaps even all people who are at the point of committing suicide would fall under that category of being vulnerable. Being suicidal might be seen as, in nearly all cases, a sign of vulnerability. So I think we are beginning to see increasing acceptance of this right to be protected. Now, as Lady Hale said, it only applies if the authorities know or ought to know of the risk of suicide. So the state can only be expected to intervene if they know or ought to know someone is at risk of suicide and falls within the protected category. And she also explained that there is this balance to be struck between the right of the individual patient to freedom and the right to self-determination, and that these need to be balanced. We'll come back again to that in a minute. But this, I think, leads us to then the key question. If the state don't know that someone is feeling suicidal, does that mean they don't have the right to be protected? Or is it rather that the state can't have the duty to protect them because it's not under, it doesn't know of the risk of suicide? Now, I'd argue it makes much more sense to say the latter. It's not that someone loses their right to be protected from committing suicide because the state doesn't know about them. It's rather that the state is not in breach of their duty because it didn't know about them. And similarly, even if the state decides the right of self-determination trumps the right to protection from suicide, as Baroness Hale mentioned, it's not that they don't have the right to suicide, it's just trumped by self-determination if you accept that kind of argument. So I think then we can see increasing acceptance by the courts of this idea that actually everybody has a right to be protected from suicide. It may well be that the state's not to be held to account because they didn't know, and that unless the person is decided to not be vulnerable, is not vulnerable, which I think would be very rare, there is a prima facie duty to be protected from suicide. It's just that the state might not be held to be accountable if they didn't know or there was nothing reasonable they could have done. So let's move next on to the ethical issues, and it's autonomy that's dominated the debates, and that's what I'm going to focus on in this discussion. There are other issues I discuss in the book, such as arguments around sanctity of life and things, but I'm going to focus here on capacity. And so this is the argument that there shouldn't be a right to be protected from suicide because people choose, or at least where people have chosen to exercise their autonomy. People should be free to commit suicide if they want. That's their autonomous choice. So that's the argument I want to look at. Now, I think that in fact, it will be very, very, very rare, perhaps impossible, but certainly very, very rare for someone to be autonomously making a decision to commit suicide. So I draw attention, first of all, to Section 3 of the Mental Capacity Act, which tells us at least what the Mental Capacity Act requires for someone to have mental capacity. First of all, they have to understand the information relevant to their decisions. They have to understand the information, they have to retain it, they have to use or weigh that information as part of a process of making the decision and communicate their decision. So I'm going to focus primarily on A and C and the academic literature around that. So first of all, someone has to know the information relevant to their decision. Now, I'm afraid reports from suicide indicate that very often people commit suicide are mistaken about the facts they're in. They think they can never be loved. They think they'll never find another job. They think that their life has no point, nobody loves them, they're a burden for everyone. So many suicidal decisions are made on the basis of things that are just mistakes. And just as the courts have very readily found that someone who, for example, refuses cancer treatment because they don't believe they've got cancer, lack capacity, because they just don't understand the key facts. We can say the same about many suicidal ideations. Secondly, someone has to weigh up the information to be able to reach a decision. But I think that too is often lacking in cases of suicide. Many of them are impulsive decisions. It's remarkable in looking at the studies on this, how few are carefully planned out. Well, many appear to be at the moment choices, they're impulsive choices. Or they're decisions where someone feels compelled to act in a particular way. Maybe they're hearing voices which are commanding them to kill themselves. Maybe they feel simply overwhelmed that there is no alternative. And that's something you often hear about accounts of people who have attempted to commit suicide, is they feel there is no alternative. This is the only thing they can do. So they are not actually acting out of, they're not feeling they've got a choice. They're not weighing. So in the theoretical literature, I'd refer here to the writing of Joseph Raz, who makes the point that autonomy is not just about having choices, it's about having good options to choose from. So he gives two particularly good examples of this. A man who is stuck in the bottom of a deep pit. And as Raz says, well, he has some options. He can take one step forward and one step back. He can sing the national anthem or sing Kumbaya. So there's choices there, but we wouldn't say he's autonomous because the choices he's got are so limited and restricted. There are no good choices there. Or the other example he gives is a woman who's on an island alone pursued by a bear. And again, Ryan says, well, she's got choices. She can go to the beach, she can climb up the mountain, she can go left and right, but she's going to be constantly being pursued and followed by this bear. So although she has options, she doesn't have any good options. The options are constrained. And again, similarly, looking at the accounts of those people who have attempted to commit suicide, they are like the man in the bottom of the pit, or like the woman who is being pursued by the bear. Their options, as it appears to them, are profoundly constrained. And so it seems to be wrong there to talk about that being an autonomous choice that someone is exercising. The theoretical literature, I think, has a really rich account of what we need for autonomy. Mackenzie and Rogers talk about the idea of self-government, to make choices and enact decisions that are consistent with one's values, beliefs, and commitments. And again, one of the accounts of, so one of the very common things amongst people who commit suicide, it's friends and relatives saying that was out of the blue. That was not how they normally were. They just were shocked how that suddenly happened. But this decision does not reflect their consistent values and beliefs. Well, thinking again of Melanie Rebecca, normally her life was happy and she was happy. Yes, she was subject to these moments of intense depression when she would want to die, but that would not be part of her consistent values and beliefs. Secondly, there's an important point about rationality, or perhaps it's more about the application of values. Now, as Craigie argues here, caring about the interests of the future inhabitants of one's body and having some grip on what those interests are seem like prerequisites for engaging successfully in these processes. Jesse Wall has written powerfully about how to exercise autonomy. You need to know the facts of your situation and to apply your values to those facts to be able to make a decision about how you want your life to go. Now, he argues if someone has lost a value of their own life, if they think their life is worthless, that they are but a worm, then they have no values that they are using to apply to the facts. But mostly accounts of autonomy talk us about trying to produce a good life for ourselves, writing the story of our life that we want our life to be. But so if therefore you've got no valuing of your own life, if you think your life counts for nothing, and therefore your values count for nothing, you're not able to apply those values to make decisions in a way which philosophers would require for autonomy. And Mackenzie and Rogers and others have also talked about this idea of authenticity, that the decisions, values, and beliefs and commitments have must be the person's own in some relevant sense. They must identify with them. They must cohere with their practical identity, a sense of who she is and what matters to her. So we can easily imagine someone who has lost authenticity. For example, someone who's the victim of domestic abuse, where their life has become simply obeying what their partner demands of them, where they no longer have their own values that they're living by, that they're simply complying with someone else's values or demands, or someone who's brainwashed into belonging to a cult or something. Again, they're not really their own values. But it's this idea of identifying with those values and those being part of someone's practical identity. And I think, again, that doesn't sit with the idea of someone who thinks their life should come to an end, or at least in many, many cases of suicide. This is not a decision that somebody is saying that the value of committing suicide or the value of feeling depressed is actually something that is core to my identity, that I accept and I embrace. I think it's striking. There are many conditions which people do embrace. So people do embrace being deaf and being part of the deaf community, and there can be real goods from that. There are not many people who will embrace depression as being actually something that can be celebrated, or that people should be seeking out depression. And I think that's a good reason. Finally, as I argue in this quote, the autonomy argument overlooks the fact that in many, many cases of attempted suicide or suicide, there have been conflicting wishes. It's very often a Melanie Rabone type case where there is an intense desire for suicide at a particular moment, but then often surrounded otherwise by times when people don't want to commit suicide. And we can see that from the very low rates of repeated suicide attempts. Most people who attempt suicide do not go on to attempt it again. So this doesn't appear to be some settled autonomous wish, it's a wish at one particular moment in time. And there's a question, I think, autonomy. If you're a fan of autonomy and you can make decisions, well, do we listen to the Melanie Rabone who is speaking when she is in a deep depression and wants to end her life? Or do we listen to the Melanie Rabone who subsequently says, I'm so glad the doctors intervened and helped me get back to how I normally like my life to be. Finally, we look at some of the philosophy, as Chris Cowley points out, maybe actually rationality and philosophy aren't the language to use. But as he says, when he hears of someone's suicide, his reaction is one of horror. It's one from the gut, as he puts it. That it's not something perhaps that's readily captured by philosophy. A different aspect I want to just mention briefly is the role of the state in suicide. And this, I think, is largely overlooked by the autonomy discourse around suicide. So here are just 3 examples of what sometimes called deaths of despair, people whose benefits have been cut off and who then go on to commit suicide. But those stories are not stories of autonomy. Those are not stories of people who have sat down and carefully weighed up the alternatives and decided for them the best for their life is to end it. Those are people driven desperate through cold and through hunger. And there's a growing amount of literature exploring the links between economic and social deprivation and suicidal links. And this is one of the reasons why I think there's a good case for saying the state has an obligation to protect people from committing suicide. Because there's a certain portion of suicides for which there's quite some responsibility laying at the door of the state. And I think we need to, part of the autonomy discourse overlooks all of these issues I mentioned in this quote. Policies in relation to asylum seeking, policies in relation to benefits, policies in relation to online bullying, the failure to intervene in image-based sexual abuse, and I could go on and on. But suicide is, that's people's choices, but these are heavily influenced by the way we choose to regulate or fail to regulate a whole set of other areas, and it insulates the state and our community from responsibility for suicide to describe it simply as a matter of exercise of personal autonomy. And there are things we can do. I haven't got time to go into the detail of this, but we can look at the first statistics, the 92% variance in suicide rates between the US, largely based on the availability of funds. And so it's not there that there are more depressed people in one state than another, or more suicidal people in one state or another. It's the availability of the means of guns and so forth that makes difference. It's notable how putting up barriers around high places, regulation against medication can have a huge impact on suicide rates. And the UK switched to packaging painkillers in much smaller packages as a notable drop in the suicide rate. So I think that shows that there are things we can do, but it also shows that these are not thought through decisions, because if these are carefully thought through autonomous decisions, you wouldn't have an impact just because you had to go to lots of different chemists to buy the tablets. And there have been some very successful suicide prevention policies in the US particularly. We've got the Detroit in the USA who work towards a 0 suicide rate, and you'll see the statistics there with remarkable effectiveness, and they did indeed reach their target of 0 or very close to 0 suicide for those directly on their care. So here's some concluding thoughts. As I said towards the end there, I think we need to move away from suicide being about autonomous choice to recognize that it reflects all sorts of things in our society about attitudes towards mental health, the failure to regulate online abuse, the failure to offer effective mental health care. But I've claimed that it's very rare. I haven't said it's impossible, but I think it's very, very rare for the reasons I set out for someone to be making a fully autonomous decision to commit suicide. In fact, in most cases, preventing suicide will actually be in line with a person's long-term settled values and wishes. The Ravone case shows she was, as I said, thrilled that she had been stopped previously from committing suicide. I think we need to recognise the responsibility of the state towards the suicide rates. And finally, I think there is a concern I have about the issues around death and dying and suicide being so dominated by debates around euthanasia and debates around assisted suicide. There's been huge and really important academic, political and campaigning work to deal with those cases. Whereas actually your normal run-of-the-mill suicide, the man killing himself because he's lost his job, has been a severe lack of academic attention, particularly among lawyers, into those cases, and lack of campaigning work in those areas. But yet those are statistically the far bigger and more significant cases. Thank you very much.